make expenses on the Crown account without parliamentary authority. Mr Chair.
Louise
Mr Chair.
Upston.
I move that the question be now put.
Chris Farfoy.
Call for part 2 of the mixed ownership model. Mr Chair, this bill is part of what the government calls the rolling wall of economic initiatives. But today we've had the ANZ Bank say that our economy is in the danger zone. The danger zone, Mr Chair. And I just want to use another line out of that famous early 80s line out of Top Gun, that in terms of concerns in this bill that we have, this is a target-rich environment, part 2. But I do want to say, a target-rich environment. It is. But, Mr Chair, I do want to look at one clause in particular, and that is in clause 16 and 45S. And I'll read it for the benefit of those people who might be listening. It is, there will be a 10% limit on holdings by persons other than the Crown. No person other than the Crown may have a relevant interest in securities that confer more than 10% of the voting rights of a mixed ownership model company, and they call this the 10% limit. And Mr Chair, this is the passing effort of the National Party to try and ensure that some, not all, some of the 49% of the shares that they plan to sell in this share float try and stay in New Zealand. Mr Chair, I do need to, as the members across the House have done ad nauseum during this debate, go back to some history, and I'll go back to January the 26th, 2011, when John Key gave a speech, and there was a press release that came out with it, and a point in that press release said New Zealand investors would have to be at the front of the queue for shareholdings, and the government would need to be confident of widespread and substantial New Zealand share ownership. These are the words out of a press release from John Key on the 26th of January on 2011. And as the press releases that come out of the ninth floor do on the odd occasion, that came with a Q&A, and there were some other points that were made. Will New Zealanders own the shares that are issued? And Mr Key in this press release said, and I quote, New Zealand investors will be given first priority in any issues. There is substantial capacity between the KiwiSaver funds and other managed funds, blah, 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 blah. The next question, will foreigners be able to buy shares? Majority ownership means that control will always rest in New Zealand hands. Will always rest in New Zealand hands, the press release says. If companies were listed on the NZX, then private New Zealand owners would be able to sell and foreign investors could buy. However, we expect that most New Zealand investors would be long-term holders. This has been the experience with previous floats such as Contact Energy. It is therefore likely that foreign ownership would be limited. Mr Speaker, nowhere in this bill, nowhere in clause 16 of this bill, does it limit the size of foreign ownership. It might limit the size of a parcel of shares that you can hold to 10%, but Mr Chair, nowhere in this bill, and I'm looking at clause 16, does it put into effect any of the words that Mr John Key, the Prime Minister of this country, said in his press release on the 26th of January 2011. So I do want to have a look at a SOP that has been put forward by our State Assets spokesperson, my colleague in front of me, Mr Clayton Cosgrove, SOP number 49, which would change a new section 45P2. Mr Bridges might want to listen. Mr Bridges might want to listen, because it would change the amount of ownership from 10%, Mr Chair, from 10% to 1%. From 10% to 1%, and I would urge members right around the House to back SOP 49 from Clayton Cosgrove to ensure that as many of these shares, and let me make clear that we don't want these shares sold at all, but as many of these shares stay in New Zealand hands, Mr Chair, and I would expect that that member for Tauranga to try and meet the needs of his constituents too, to make sure that these shares stay in New Zealanders' hands. Mr Chair, there is another SOP also in my name, an excellent SOP, thank you very much, Darian Fenton. SOP number 51, which would also look to amend clause 16 by inserting 45Y. It is titled in this SOP, Kiwis at the front of the queue. Mr Chair?
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair.
Chris
and my SOP 51 would restrict the sale of the shares in these state-owned enterprises to only people who hold a current New Zealand passport. And, Mr Chair, I'm trying to put into effect in this bill what the Prime Minister promised but hasn't actually delivered in this bill. It hasn't actually delivered in this bill because, as we heard before, Mr Chair, the Prime Minister of this country said that a majority of the shares that will be floated would stay in New Zealand hands, but has not affected this in the legislation that is before us in Part 2. So if we are looking at those who currently hold New Zealand passports, I can tell those at home that would mean that 3,225,000 New Zealanders with passports at the moment would be eligible and only eligible to buy our shares in this share float, Mr Speaker. So then if you put that together with Mr Cosgrove's SOP, and the fact that only the maximum amount of shareholdings you can have is 1%, we would not concentrate a lot of the value of SOEs either overseas or with one individual holding too much power. So I think in tandem, those SOPs and a number of other SOPs that have been put forward from this side of the House to Part 2 would be very wise for this House, very sensible for this House to adopt. I do also want to look at 45T. And this is very interesting, and it covers. Thank you. I was just going to get onto it. I saw you giving me the evils. And 45T talks about the penalties of exceeding the 10% limit, which is currently in this bill around 45S, and 45T1A. And B and C outlines the penalties that if we did happen to go over the 10% limit, it gives those who transgress in this way 60 days, I believe, to make good, but then that would also give them 60 days to make a profit off those shares and then hawk them off and get back down to that 10% limit. So, Mr Chair, in terms of 45T, we do have some problems there. And also around 45TC, you can... it says, while the person contravenes that section, they cannot exercise or control the voting rights that exceed the 10% limit. And, well, that's actually quite common sense, and we would actually support that. So we don't look at making any amendment there. But I believe there is an amendment to 45T in the name of my colleague Claire Curran. 45T. I'll continue while my colleague does track that down, but I do believe there is an SOP under Claire Curran's name, and I'll just have a look here, to make sure that there is a penalty for anyone who exceeds that exceeds that 10% limit, and Claire Curran's supplementary order paper would institute a financial penalty for breaching the ownership limit applied to the mixed ownership model, which at the moment, Mr Chair, stands at 10%. So, Mr Chair, I just did want to say that despite the musings from the Prime Minister a year and a half ago that he would protect our assets from foreign ownership, he has in no way enacted this in the legislation before us. I think that's sad. I would ask this House that they adopt the supplementary order papers from myself, from the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove and from Claire Curran to make sure that if these assets are sold, Mr Chair, as many of them can stay in New Zealand in the ownership of Kiwis, and I don't want to use mums and dads, but in the ownership of New Zealanders, and that we don't let the limit of 10% as it stands in 45S at the moment, Mr Chair. We need to make sure that the value is spread right around those Kiwis who want to own these shares. They don't want to, they prefer they not be sold. But also, if they are going to be sold, then maybe we should look at my SOP and restrict the ownership, restrict the sale of these shares to current holders of New Zealand passports. I think it's a common sense measure to bring in such an SOP, and I would hope that as I look around the House this evening, that members, at least on this side of the House, would support my supplementary order paper, and perhaps there may be a few members across the House who can see this as a common sense measure too.
Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.